Well, good morning. Welcome back to today's edition of our daily devotion. This morning we're going to be in Psalm number 16. If you'd like to go ahead and open your Bibles and find your way there. While you're looking for Psalm 16, let me remind you that we are now open for corporate worship on Sunday mornings at 9 and 11. The room is set up so we can practice social distancing and maintain our healthy distance from one another. But we're glad to be back. If you're able to join us, we hope you will. But on the other hand, let me do add that if you're afraid to come back, if you're worried about your health, if you're concerned about maybe somebody you live with and their weak health system, stay home by all means. We understand. We don't judge you. We're not going to condemn you or blame you for it. We just want to be able to gather back together for those who are interested and able to do so. And we're grateful for those who will be joining us some point in the near future. We're also meeting on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock for our continuing study of the book of Romans. We've got another 11 or 12 weeks left in that study before we finally transition back to the Old Testament and perhaps the book of Exodus. But we're going to continue to do both of these, both Sunday morning and Wednesday nights. We're currently live streaming them on Facebook. The production value is not very high. They're not very professional looking. We understand that. We're just trying to make do. Thanks to the generosity of a number of our folks at Doorway, we've been able to order some equipment so that we'll be able to live stream, to continue to broadcast our services once we have the equipment in place on into the future, not just through the virus, but from now on, so that if you're sick, if you're shut in for various reasons, or for our former members and loved ones who live elsewhere around the country or even around the world, they'll be able to join us by the internet. And so thank you to those who gave money to help support that ministry. All that is on order. All of it will be in soon. And hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll be able to get that up and running and figure out again how to do that well also. But this morning, we're in Psalm number 16. So let's go ahead and read it, and then we'll kind of walk our way through it quickly. David again writes, "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offering of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Now again, we've been now doing these for almost 2 months, working our way through the book of Psalms, a few a week. It's fascinating as we've been reading them in order. Remember, they're not categorized by type of psalm. Some are messianic, some are royal, some are imprecatory. We're praying for God's punishment or deliverance on enemies. They're not chronological. They're not thematic. And yet, as we've been going through them this spring, you've noticed over and over how many times the messages of each and every individual psalm has spoken to our present situation, either with the pandemic or maybe in your own life with family problems or financial issues. God seems to have a word for us each and every day from the book of Psalms. Same thing is true here again of Psalm number 16. It's a psalm of David, King David, the psalm writer. Again, remember, he wrote 73 of the 150. And so it's hard not to find a Psalm of David. Just look around the corner and there'll be another one tomorrow or the day after. But as we read these, we're reminded of all the various trials and tribulations David saw in his life, whether it was the opposition from Saul or the Philistines or his own children. David knew a little bit about trouble. He knew a little bit about difficulties in life, and he knew a lot about calling on God and trusting him to rescue him or deliver him. And so as we read David's Psalms, we're encouraged. We see somebody who's been through what we're going through, and we hear from somebody who has a word of hope or encouragement for us, regardless of what it is that we might be experiencing right now. Let's walk our way quickly through this psalm, and let's just see what David has to add today to our thoughts, to our prayer lives, to build our faith. David begins by again acknowledging, confessing his total and utter dependence on God for deliverance. Preserve me, O God. Save me. Put a wall around me. Protect me. Why? For in you I take refuge. Again, yet another illustration from David of God being our hope, our rock, our high tower, in this case, our sanctuary, if you will, our place of shelter and protection. He cries out, he says, I say to the Lord in verse 2, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As James writes in his epistle in the New Testament, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights above. David recognizes, acknowledges, as should we, that all the good in our life comes from God. We don't deserve it. We can't earn it. God gives it out of his pure mercy and goodness. We have no good apart from him. As for the saints in the land, for the others who are followers of God, they're the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. As we see so often, as we've seen in the book of 1 John, we're going to see it again. We're going to see it again and again as we go through the book of John, that we're to love the brothers, to care for those who are also the children of God. They ought to be in whom we have our delight. On the other hand, verse 4 talks about those who do not pursue God. The sorrows of those who run after other gods shall multiply. They think it's bad now, it's only going to get worse. David says, but their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names on my lips. They may appear to be struggling, or they may appear to be succeeding. Either way would have nothing to do with it. Instead of taking their gods and their offerings on ourselves, David says in verse 5, the Lord is my chosen portion, and he's my cup. He's where we turn for help. He's where we find our satisfaction. He's where we're going to get our hope for all things. And he says in verse 5, the second part, why that's the case, he says, you hold my lot. Now, today in the American context, we hear the word lot. We think of multitudes, like I got lots of stuff. Or we think about the lot that your house sits on. But remember in the Old Testament, a lot here is the idea of casting lots, right? They chose the new apostle to replace Judas by casting lots. When they picked a day to persecute the Jewish people in the book of Esther, they cast lots. A lot is the idea of our fate. It's God holding us in his hand providentially. God holds our lot. What we get from God. What happens to us happens because God permits it or God ordains it. But in light of that, David adds in verse 6, the lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Now he is talking about land, property lines. It says, indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. Remember the value of the land for the Jewish people in the Old Testament. It's the promised land. It's the land that proves that they're in the covenant with God, that God has been faithful and that they remain faithful. That's why it's so important who owns the land, where they live, to make sure the land is passed down from one generation to another. That's why it was so devastating for them to be exiled and sent away. But David says, I have a beautiful inheritance. What comes from God, our future in our case, our lot, the new Jerusalem, the heavenly home, place in God's mansion for us. I have a beautiful inheritance, David writes. So he says, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. And the night my heart also instructs me. He praises God that God gives him direction. Direction like we're reading this morning in Psalm number 16. He says, I set the Lord always before me. Because he's at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Following the Ark of the Covenant through the wilderness led them to the land. Following the Ark through the Jordan River led them across on dry ground. Following God in all things is our hope. He'll lead us on straight paths. He'll lead us to the high places, the Old Testament prophet writes. Why? Because he's at our right hand. Because he's at our right hand, at our position of strength, cannot be shaken. I shall not be shaken. As long as we're with God and God is at our side, we're good to go. Therefore, because of all that, he says, my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. So spiritually, he's good to go, as well as his physical. Doesn't matter the circumstance. God is in control. He has us. Why is he confident in that? Knowing that this might be a case where somebody's trying to kill him, where he might physically be endangered. The answer comes in verse 10. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. Sheol here represents death. You will not let my soul die, he says. When I pass, when they bury my body, my soul will live on. David has an understanding of eternal life. And that's because of what he says in the second part of verse 10. Or he will not let his Holy One, David certainly is not holy. You're not holy. He says, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. The Holy One is a reference to the Messiah. When the Messiah dies, here's a foreshadowing of his death. He will be buried, but God will not leave him there for corruption. He'll be raised from the dead. His body will not rot in the grave. The New Testament tells us clearly in the book of Hebrews, this is a prophecy regarding the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's our real hope. Not that we get out of this life alive, we probably won't, but that we'll get through death alive. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He's been there, and he'll take us through it with him. Verse 11 then, you make known to me the path of life. See the connections between some of these psalms? In your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. May we take our comfort, our solace, and our hope in God's presence, and may we trust his Holy One, who raised from the dead, that we might be raised from the dead as well. May God bless you and keep you until we see you again.